Ever find yourself like drowning in a sea of information, scrolling and scrolling and wondering, how am I supposed to learn anything with all this coming at me?
Totally. It's like our brains are trying to keep up with, I don't know, a million tabs open at once.
Exactly. And that's what we're tackling in this deep dive. We're diving into Learning Theories, an Educational Perspective by Dale H. Chunk. Because Chunk actually starts with something kind of simple, like what even is learning? He says it's about change, a change that lasts.
Right. Not just remembering something for a test and then poof, gone.
Gone. It's about experiences actually getting in there, rewiring things, changing how we think, how we react. It's like, when you order takeout on that app a few times and suddenly you're a pro?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's learning in action. But before we get lost in the digital weeds, let's rewind a bit. I've got our expert here to help us trace, the history of how we even understand learning. So, ready to dive into the origins of how we learn.
Let's do it. To really get a grip on learning theories today, you have to start way back with this age-old debate. Is knowledge something we're born with, or is it all about experience?
Ooh, the nature versus nurture debate, right?
Yeah.
Classic. Were Michelangelo, Da Vinci, those guys, were they just wired for it from day one?
Right. It's a fascinating question, and early philosophers like Plato, they were in the born with it camp, this idea that some knowledge is just inherently in us. But then fast forward a bit, John Locke comes along in the 17th century and he's like, nope, blank slate.
Blank slate.
Yeah, our minds are totally empty canvases when we're born, and our experiences, they're the paint. Every interaction, every sight, every sound, it all shapes us.
Huh. So everything we encounter basically creates who we are, how we think.
Exactly. Now, imagine going from those big philosophical ideas to actually trying to study learning in, a lab setting.
Oh, right, because people actually started doing experiments and stuff, didn't they?
Yeah, and that's a big shift. Late 19th century, you've got folks like Wilhelm Wundt, pioneers of experimental psychology.
So we go from philosophers debating to scientists in lab coats trying to measure and analyze learning.
It was huge. Think about Hermann Ebbinghaus, this guy who meticulously studied his own memory using these made-up syllables. Sounds basic, but his work helped us get how we forget things, the role of repetition.
Wow, so those were like the first building blocks of how we understand learning now.
For sure. And from those early experiments, a whole new field explodes, people dedicated to figuring out this learning thing. But as you might guess, it gets complicated.
Of course. I mean, think about how many different ways there are to learn: reading, watching, heck, even listening to this deep dive, right?
Exactly.
So how do researchers even begin to study something so complex? What are the tools of the trade, so to speak?
Well, one common way is correlational research, basically seeing if two things are linked. Do students who study more get better grades? But here's the thing.
Just because two things go together doesn't mean one actually causes the other, right?
You got it. So that's where experiments come in. You carefully control things to see if one thing directly affects learning, like comparing different teaching methods to see which works better.
Okay, so that's like the hard data, the numbers. But learning, it's also really personal, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's experience is different.
You're right, and that's where qualitative research shines. It dives into the why behind things. Interviews, observations, personal stories, stuff you might miss if you're just looking at numbers.
So it's like having a whole toolkit of different ways to understand this learning thing, each one giving you a slightly different perspective.
Perfectly put.
And speaking of different perspectives, let's talk about the big theories that have shaped how we think about learning.
It really is fascinating how many different ways there are to approach it. And you're right, each learning theory is like a different lens.
Okay, so let's try on some of those lenses. I remember back in school learning about behaviorism, Pavlov, those dogs, the whole bell and treat thing.
Right.
It seems so simple, but does that really explain how we learn?
Well, behaviorism had its moment. The focus on observable actions, rewards, and punishments, it makes sense for some things, like training a pet. Right?
Yeah. If you want a dog to learn a trick, you use treats.
Exactly. Or even think about how we encourage certain behaviors in kids, Rewards can be powerful.
So it's like our behaviors are shaped by this system of consequences, good or bad.
Yeah, but the thing is, behaviorism doesn't really explain the stuff happening inside our brains. It's too simple. Imagine trying to understand a whole orchestra by just listening to one instrument at a time.
You'd miss the whole symphony.
Right. And that's where cognitivism comes in. It shifts the focus to those internal mental processes, how we pay attention, how we remember things.
Okay, so instead of just seeing the behavior, We're trying to understand the mental machinery behind it.
Exactly. Cognitivism says we're not passive, just soaking things up like sponges. Our minds are actively organizing, storing, making sense of information.
It's like we're building these mental models of the world, right? And those models affect how we learn new things.
Exactly. And that actually leads really well into constructivism, the next big theory.
Which is all about, like, actively constructing our own knowledge.
Yes. It's not just about taking in information, it's about doing something with it, questioning, connecting to what you already know, making it meaningful to you.
Oh, I get it. It's the difference between, like, watching a documentary about Italy and actually going to Italy. You experience it, get lost in the little streets.
And you come away with your own unique story, right?
Yes. That's such a good way to put it. So, okay, we've gone from behaviorism, which is all about external stuff, to cognitivism,
Yeah.
looking at the mind, and now constructivism, where it becomes even more personal.
And it's right here, with all these theories on the table, that Dale Shunk poses this really interesting question. He says, do these models, designed for classrooms and textbooks, do they really hold up in our digital world?
Ooh, good point. Like trying to understand the latest viral TikTok trend using like a 1950s etiquette book.
Right. The whole landscape has shifted. And Shunk points to this newer theory, connectivism, as a way to make sense of it.
Connectivism.
Mm-hmm.
What makes that one different?
Well, most learning theories focus on the individual, right? But connectivism says, hold on, a lot of learning happens out there in the network. It's distributed.
Okay, so not just in our heads, but like spread across the internet, our devices, those connections we make online.
Exactly. It's less about what you know as an individual and more about your ability to tap into this network, this flow of information.
So it's like the internet itself is a kind of giant learning network. And being good at learning means being good at navigating that network.
You got it. It's about finding good sources, filtering out the noise, making connections between different pieces of information.
Wow. So it's not about having all the answers in your head, but knowing where to find those answers, how to evaluate them. That's a whole different way of thinking about expertise.
And a really crucial one in our world, right? When information is constantly changing, evolving.
You can't just be a walking encyclopedia anymore because the encyclopedia is always getting updated.
Exactly. You have to be comfortable with that, with not having all the answers. It's about being a lifelong learner, adapting, connecting with new ideas.
Like always hit and refresh, making sure your knowledge is up to date.
Perfectly said. But here's the thing. This isn't just theoretical, Connectivism is happening right now, all around us. It's changing how we work, how we learn, how we connect.
So it's like connectivism is less about what's in our heads and more about how we're all connected.
Yeah.
But how does that actually play out? Like, give me some real world examples.
Okay, well, think about how businesses work today. It's all about collaboration, right? Teams of people with specialized knowledge coming together.
Instead of just one expert calling all the shots.
Right. Companies are realizing that the best solutions come from those connections, the network effect.
Makes sense. And what about the media? That's got to be completely different in a connectivist world.
Oh, totally. I mean,
Yeah.
think about how we get our news now. It's not just waiting for the evening news anymore. Social media, online sources, it's a constant stream.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like a fire hose.
Right. But the thing is, that constant flow, it forces us to think differently. We have to evaluate sources, decide who to trust, connect the dots ourselves.
So it can't just be passive anymore. We're all curating our own feeds, choosing what we pay attention to.
Exactly. And that's a form of learning, too. We're
Yeah.
constantly filtering, evaluating, making decisions about what information matters to us.
Okay, so with all this in mind, this whole idea of connectivism, how do we make sure we're not just getting swept away? It seems like knowledge is constantly changing, so how can we ever feel grounded?
That's the big question, right? And it's funny because connectivism says, maybe that's the wrong question to ask. It's not about finding some solid ground that doesn't move. It's about learning to dance in the whirlwind.
So being comfortable with uncertainty, accepting that things are always in flux.
Exactly. And that takes different skills, adaptability, critical thinking, being willing to admit you don't know everything, and being open to new information.
So it's less about being an expert and more about being an expert learner.
Nailed it. And that's something we can all keep working on no matter what field we're in.
That's a great point to end on. A huge thank you to our expert for walking us through this whole world of learning theories. It's amazing how much our understanding has evolved. And to all our listeners, remember, you're not just along for the ride in this digital age. You're active participants. So keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep those brains buzzing. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.